Brilliant Brevities, number 1, side 1. Hello, this is Mike Basman. I'll be going through a few short games with you. I'll be tackling them in a rather different manner to what is generally done, in the sense that I won't have seen the games before, and I'll be trying to work out what I would do in the circumstances before actually checking on what move that was played. This obviously will have its advantages in the analysis, maybe a little fresher, less hindsight. On the other hand, there's a disadvantage that as you'll be hearing my thoughts, you probably lose the position now and then, because we all know how muddled thinking generally is. First moves, if you've got the position set up, were 1 pawn to king 4 for white, and then black went pawn to king 4. So this is going to be at least the standard opening, which was very favoured in olden days, still is quite favoured, and was considered to be perhaps one of the best opening situations for both players. Pawns on king 4. White went knight to kb3. It does block the king's bishop pawn, but on the other hand, it does attack the black king pawn, and also white will be wanting to later expand with pawn to qb3 and pawn to queen 4. And this will be his means of opening a line, making a pawn breaking the center, having renounced, for the time being, pawn to king's bishop 4. So black plays knight to qb3 to defend his pawn. There are of course other moves, but this can't be a bad one. And white plays bishop to knight 5. Bishop to qb4 at first sight looks a more logical and direct move, to put a bishop on a diagonal which has been weakened by the movement of the black pawn to king 4. But bishop to knight 5 has got more concealed punch, and this is the move which over the years has proved far more popular than bishop to qb4. There isn't as yet a threat to win the king pawn. In fact, you may wish to switch off here and decide why in fact there isn't a threat to win the king pawn. It appears white is threatening bishop takes knight, and after black plays pawn takes bishop, white can play knight takes pawn. However, it's not as simple as that. Well, perhaps you've looked at the position after bishop takes knight. Now black may recapture with the queen's pawn, yeah? And white plays knight takes king's pawn, yeah? Then black may either play queen to knight 4, that hits the knight on king 5 and the pawn on knight 2, and it looks like he's going to get his pawn back therefore with that double attack. Or black can play queen to queen 5, again hitting two things, hitting the knight on king 5 and the pawn on king 4. So if you replace those pieces, you should have a black queen back on queen 1, white knight on kb3, and black knight on qb3, black pawn on queen 2, black pawn on king 4, and white bishop on queen's knight 5. Right, if you replace those pieces, you now learn why there isn't a threat to win the pawn, and therefore why black can ignore that attack to some extent. So in this position, black chose to play pawn to queen's rook 3, banking on the fact that white won't play bishop takes knight to win the pawn. White dropped the bishop back to rook 4, and still keeping the eye on the knight. Here black can push the bishop back again with pawn to queen's knight 4, but he perhaps doesn't want to put that bishop back onto a strong diagonal. And you may say, well, what would white have achieved by doing this? Perhaps not too much. Perhaps he may have achieved the weakening of the black queenside pawns. Let's see, if black played pawn to queen's knight 4, white played bishop to knight 3, then white does have a possibility again of trying to open a line later with pawn to queen's rook 4. On the other hand, black's expansion on the queen side may also give him the chance of developing his bishop to knight 2. So these are double-edged and not too clear questions we'll be discussing. So let's continue with more straightforward ideas. So let's have white's bishop back onto queen's rook 4, and black's pawn should be on queen's knight 2. Yeah. Black just played pawn to queen's rook 3, and white's bishop went back to rook 4. So black plays knight to kb3 in this position. This was his move to attack white's king's pawn. And let's see what did white do here. Did he defend the pawn? Yes, he did. He played queen to king 2 to defend the pawn. Slightly more normal is actually to play castles in this position, but that is another question, the positions which arise from that move. So white played queen to king 2, looks quite a nice square for the queen. And black now pushed the bishop away with pawn to queen's knight 4. The bishop went back to knight 3. Now let's switch off here a few minutes and just study the position for a few minutes, see what we'd play as black say. Well, if you've looked at the position a while, I think I'd probably as black get my bishop out to either bishop 4 or king 2, might even try bishop to knight 2, or pawn to queen 3. Not too worried by white's threat of knight to king's knight 5, because I can answer that with pawn to queen 4. No, perhaps king's knight 5 may be possibly a strong move for white. So perhaps I develop a bishop onto king 2 or bishop 4. Yeah. So actually black played bishop to bishop 4, nice aggressive post. And what will white do here? Perhaps pawn to queen's rook 4, or castles. Now white actually chose here pawn to bishop 3 to try and open up the center, to try and play pawn to queen 4. Yeah. Well, castling doesn't look bad here for black, and if white plays a trap, as it is, called knight takes king's pawn, then black plays knight takes knight, white plays pawn to queen 4. Yeah, forking the bishop and the knight. I expect black could probably play bishop to knight 2. White will play, I suppose, pawn takes bishop, and black could play perhaps knight takes pawn. And it seems to me he has active position. Anyway, what did black actually try? He played queen to king 2. That's okay. Reinforcing his king's pawn. And white castled. And now either castles or pawn to queen 3 is possible here, I think. Also looks quite good. So black played pawn to queen 3, yeah, in answer to white's castle. Now what should white do here? Let's pause a moment. Well, I don't see anything for white here, perhaps, except white cannot play at the moment pawn to queen 4. He may try to get it in by playing rook to queen 1, but I think I'd rather prefer something like pawn to queen 3, and then steadily bringing his pieces out, maybe the bishop to king 3 or knight 5, and then the queen's knight out. Later white may either try for pawn to queen's rook 4, or try for pawn to king's bishop 4, which may be in the long run his best chance. He'd have to move a few pieces out of the way, but that looks okay. So what did white actually play? He actually did try rook to queen 1. Well, that's certainly aggressive. And what should black do here? Well, I'm beginning to see a few hidden beauties in white's move rook to queen 1, which I previously didn't like, because if was white really threatening pawn to queen 4, say, let's say he plays pawn to queen 4, black plays pawn takes pawn, white plays pawn takes pawn. Then black will have to move his bishop back, but it looks like white's king's pawn is en prise. In fact, it won't be, because if black ever did play queen takes king's pawn, white would play queen takes queen, black knight takes, and then white would move his bishop to queen 5, hitting both knights. Yeah, so that would be a bit unfortunate. Now, to stop pawn to queen 4, perhaps one way is to play combinatively bishop to knight 5, king's knight 5, yeah? Then if white plays pawn to king's rook 3, black could play bishop takes knight, though that does give white an extra bishop, and I think quite good play. Not an extra piece, a bishop, yeah? Black could, on the other hand, perhaps you should make these moves on the board. Bishop to king's knight 5, to pin the knight, so white can't play pawn to queen 4. Pawn to king's rook 3 by white, perhaps now pawn to king's rook 4. And now if white plays pawn takes bishop, black plays pawn takes pawn. Now black's a pawn down, but he's opened up the line of his rook against the king, and his pawn is also attacking the knight. So white may have to move the knight back to king 1, whereupon pawn to knight 6 is an aggressive thrust, which could put white in a bit of difficulty. So let's return those pieces a little bit. Put black's pawn back on king's rook 2 and white's pawn back on king's rook 2. And black's bishop back on qb1 and white's knight on kb3. I suppose the other possibility is for black to cast and allow white to play pawn to queen 4, which would give white some edge in the center. Let's see what black actually chose. He did in fact castle, yeah? Now I imagine white is going to go thematically pawn to queen 4. Yes. Now what will black play? He can give up center, as it is called, by playing pawn takes pawn. And then when white plays pawn takes pawn, the pawn is guarded sufficiently, and he will then have 2 pawns abreast in the center. And then if black's bishop goes back to knight 3, white can actually bring his knight out onto qb3, which will also guard his king pawn, and he'll have certainly good looking development. On the whole, bishop to knight 3 looks better for black than playing pawn takes pawn, giving up the center, yeah? Bishop knight 3 looks better, and then if pawn to queen's rook 4, well, that's not so easy, such an easy move to answer actually. Perhaps black would have to then play pawn to knight 5. Even knight rook 4 though is possible. Right, so white played pawn to queen 4. Let's see what black did. Now in this position, black, after white's pawn to queen 4, dropped his bishop back to knight 3. And I expect white could play pawn to queen's rook 4, or we might play bishop to king's knight 5. Now, that pin by bishop to knight, king's knight 5 on the knight could be a bit annoying, especially as black has castled. Had he not castled, and perhaps his last move was a slight error, perhaps he should not have castled so soon. Had he not castled, then he wouldn't be afraid to knock the bishop away by pawn to king's rook 3. But in this case, if he knocks the bishop away by pawn to king's rook 3, bishop goes back to rook 4, he may be thinking twice about playing pawn to king's knight 4, because this moves the pawns around his king and therefore tends to deny the king a bit of shelter, even though this might be, in this given situation, a possible course for black. So let's see what white played. Yes, white did in fact move his bishop to king's knight 5. I think I might do the same for black here. My bishop on, if I played now here for black, bishop to king's knight 5, I'd be pinning white's knight on king's bishop 3 as well, and trying to increase the pressure on white's queen 4 square, which was defended by the knight. So let's see what black played to white's bishop knight 5. Now in this position, black actually played knight to queen 1. Now what's the idea of that move? I think it must be to bring the knight to king 3 to attack the white bishop, which however could still move back to king's rook 4. Yeah? Let's make these moves. Black may be threatening knight to king 3, bishop moves back to rook 4, but then black could perhaps go into bishop 5 with his knight, and that hits the queen, and this is rather annoying attack on the queen. Queen may go back to may go to king 3, then even the knight could drop back to knight 3 or something like that, and then black would attack that bishop again, and I think finally he'll be able to break the pin. So let's put those pieces back. Black knight back on queen 1, white queen back on king 3, white bishop back on king's knight 5. And let's see what we would do as white against this move. Right, I think in this sort of position I wouldn't be sure quite how to continue, but I would consider pawn to queen's rook 4 to break open on the queen's side. Let's see what white's actual move was. Now white's actual move was knight to rook 4, and that is in fact a very cunning idea. Now let's see, it does stop black's knight to king 3, which he was clearly intending last move, yeah? Because if knight to king 3, then white's knight comes in onto bishop 5. Yeah, make these moves. Knight comes into bishop 5. Black queen may have to go back to queen 1. Then white might, let's see, what could white do here? Might play pawn takes king's pawn, and then if knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, though this doesn't lead to all that much, might find something better. Have you got anything better? Let's see. Well, in this position too, it isn't 100% clear what white would do. He might have to drop his bishop back to rook 4, allowing knight to bishop 5. Or perhaps he might drop the bishop back to bishop 1, and that would maintain his control of kb4 square. Anyway, let's return black's queen back to king 2, black's knight back onto queen 1, and white's knight back onto kr4. So let's see, white, if What if black plays pawn to king's rook 3 in this position? No. You might like to switch off and see what you'd do in that circumstance. Say black plays pawn to king's rook 3 after white's knight rook 4 to drive away the white bishop on knight 5. Right, well in that position white would in fact go knight to knight 6. Now the knight cannot be taken because of the pin of that bishop on knight 3, and the knight is in fact forking the queen and the rook, and say if black moves his queen away, white will take the knight and then take the rook, ending up at least exchanged to the good. So black is stymied somewhat. Perhaps knight to king 3 may be the best chance. Let's see how he did in fact continue. He played knight to king 3, which is given a question mark. Right, so let's pause again and see if we can find any good moves for white here. Right, so I think we'd probably play knight to bishop 5 here for white, and black looks like we'll drop back onto queen 1. So let's see what happens here. The note to this says that if black retreats his queen to queen 1, there comes the sly point. Bishop takes knight, the one on king 6 that is, and then black plays pawn takes bishop. Clearly if he plays bishop takes bishop, then white will play pawn takes pawn, and there's a pin of the rook down the queen file, and black therefore can't recapture with his pawn on queen 3. So after white's bishop takes knight, black plays pawn takes bishop, then white goes knight takes knight's pawn. The idea being that the knight, black will now play king takes knight, and white plays pawn takes pawn. And there's a pin down the queen file, and there's another pin on the knight from the bishop. So white should get his piece back. Let's say if black plays king to knight 1, then white will just play pawn takes knight on bishop 6. And let's see, what's he up? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right, so white would be 2 pawns up, and also he'd have quite an attack on the king, black's king side being open. I don't think we black players should let this pass without some sort of resistance. So let's replace that black king on knight 2, white pawn on king 5, black pawn on kb3. Sorry, black knight on kb3, yeah? So there's white pawn on king 5. Let's pause here and see what we can discover. My first thought here is to try and take advantage of the open king's bishop file by playing perhaps, well, if we play bishop takes pawn check, then he can't take with the queen or the king because of knight takes king's pawn. On the other hand, you can play king to rook 1, and I'm not sure what we do after that. What else is there? We could play knight takes king's pawn, but then bishop takes queen again looks good for white. If black plays rook takes bishop pawn, then even queen takes knight. And then if rook to king 2 discovered check, looks like queen to queen 4. Anyway, white should end up with some extra material. Now let's see, if you moved any of the pieces in that analysis, I adjusted quickly, better put them all back, and that would mean there would be a white king on knight 1, white pawn on kb2, and pawn on queen on queen 1. And the bishop should be on knight 3. So it looks pretty disastrous in this position. Perhaps we can go back a move to when white played knight takes knight's pawn. So let's have black's king back on knight 1, white's knight on knight 7, and white's pawn on queen 4, and there should be a black pawn on king 4. Yeah. So white's just played this devastating knight takes knight's pawn. Let's pause again, see if we can find anything good for black here. Well, I'd probably like to play here pawn. Black pawn takes white's queen's pawn, but I'm not sure what I'd do if white then went knight to rook 5, intensifying the pin on the knight. Might be another move, say moving the black queen to queen 2, just giving up the pawn that white has taken. And also now this queen does break the pin and threatens the knight. So what is white going to do? White can go knight to rook 5. Well, I don't think I like that for him. Might go bishop takes knight. Rook takes bishop, then knight to rook 5. Rook goes back to, let's say, bishop 2. Now, let's have another look at this position. If white goes check here, the king will go to rook 1. White will accomplish nothing. And let's see, white could take the king pawn with his queen's pawn, but then he's going to lose his own bishop pawn. Black could play, well, maybe rook takes bishop pawn, or even bishop takes pawn check. Perhaps rook takes bishop pawn looks the best. And well, he regains his pawn, and then he can follow up by bishop to knight 2. So it looks like it's not so easy for white in this position. He hasn't developed his queenside pieces yet. His knights ran off, hopping onto the king's side, causing havoc, but he hasn't developed his queen's knight, queen rook, stuck away. Black hasn't developed his pieces either on the queen's side, his queen's bishop, but they may come into action. Let's say white goes knight to rook 3 here, yeah? That's queen's rook 3, get a piece out. He doesn't go queen 2 because he'll lose his queen's pawn. Let's see, the black could go bishop to knight 2, bringing another piece to bear. White knight to bishop 2, maybe. Black rook to kb1. I think black's got quite an attack on the king's side. He may be doing quite well, in which case it would just prove that white shouldn't have done that time-wasting knight maneuver which won in the game. So let's get back to the actual position. When white played knight to bishop 5 and black, we were looking at what would happen if black played queen to queen 1. Let's replace all those pieces. Quite a lot to replace this time. Let's give the black position. It should be a black rook on queen's rook 1, black bishop on qb1, black rook on kb1, black king on king's knight 1, black queen on king 2, black pawn on kb2, kn2, kr2, and knights on king 3 and kb3, and a black pawn on king 4. And I don't think the other pieces have moved. And white's got a knight on kb5, bishop on kn5, pawn on king 4, another on queen 4, and white queen on king 2, white knight on knight 1, and there should be a white bishop on queen's knight 3. Right, I hope I haven't gone too fast. If I have, then you can sort of switch off and rewind and set the position up then. Now, so what black in fact played queen to king 1, and then what shall we play now? White played bishop takes knight on bishop 6. Black played pawn takes bishop, and then what? Bishop takes the other knight, yeah? Pawn takes bishop. Looks like it's going to be mate. Queen and knight for check. Not quite mate. I think black resigned here. Yeah, because if queen to knight 3 by black, knight to king 7 check will be mate. And if king to rook 1, queen to knight 7 is mate. Brilliant brevities, side 2. Now, if you'll have the pieces set up again, we'll have a look at another game. This one began with white going pawn to queen 4, black knight to kb3. So white has put a pawn in the center, releasing one piece, as black has in fact brought out a piece, and this knight is clearly quite well placed on king's bishop 3. For a start, it stops white from playing his pawn up to king 4, because in that case that pawn would be lost. White, of course, could now push his pawn on to queen 5, but it would be attacked by black moving his pawn to qb3 or king 3. So white didn't waste time that way. He played knight to kb3, king's bishop 3 here, bringing a piece out, and black played pawn to king 3. Again, black's move increases slightly his hold on the center by because the pawn is aiming at queen 4, and it also releases the king's bishop. And once the king's bishop moves, then black may castle. So white played pawn to bishop 4. Because he can't occupy the center with pawn to king 4, he tries to occupy it by pawn to queen's bishop 4. And black here played bishop to knight 5 check. This check isn't, of course, can't do much against the white king, but it does serve the purpose of bringing out the bishop, and therefore it's a developing move. The bishop indeed may become exchanged, but that probably suits black, as he's the second player and he doesn't mind exchanging pieces, which will hinder white from building up a strong attack. After this check on knight 5, white has got many ways to interpose. May play bishop to queen 2, simplest perhaps, or knight to queen 2, perhaps the soundest in many ways, because then white may begin to try and push the bishop away with pawn to queen's rook 4. He may also play knight to qb3, but then of course he'll have to decide whether he wants to accept doubled pawns or not, and doubled pawns can be a weakness even in the middle game. White chose the safest move, perhaps knight to queen 2, but it also reserves his options. Had he played bishop to queen 2, black would probably exchange off the bishops. Here, by playing queen's knight to queen 2, white wants to then go pawn to queen's rook 3, and then if black plays bishop takes knight check, then white will recapture, and he will have gained a small advantage in the opening, which is a bishop against a knight. the bishop is generally reckoned to be slightly better than the knight. Now, had white gone to knight to qb3, black wouldn't have been so unhappy about exchanging his bishop for the knight. The reason is that he would have made white's position slightly less fluid, because he'd have doubled white's pawns, and doubled pawns tend to lack mobility. Now it's mobile positions which bishops like, mobile and open positions, whereas knights quite often prefer static positions, and that's why the exchange for the bishop of knight would tend to a slightly more static position if it gave doubled pawns. Now that's why white put his knight on queen 2. Clearly I'm not going to go too deeply into these ideas of positional ideas of double pawns and things like that. Just give brief ideas on it. Let's continue with the game. Here black played knight to king 5, and here you can see the knight comes into king 5, cannot now be captured, and it does put pressure on white's knight at queen 2. On the other hand, this isn't a very dangerous attack, because white has defended that knight on queen 2 with no less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4 pieces, and black has only got 2 pieces on it, and he doesn't look like he's going to be able to get more on it. So this looks more like a maneuver which would lead to exchanges rather than an advantage to black. Let's switch off and study the position for a little while. Well, there were quite a few moves for white in this position. The most direct are for him to ask black either to do something about his bishop by, say, white playing pawn to queen rook 3, or to do something about his knight. White could go here, queen to bishop 2. So let's see what white does. No, he doesn't do either. He plays pawn to king 3, which has the point. It ignores the black's demonstration for the time being. Later white will bring his bishop out to queen 3, and this will attack the knight on king 5. So black could perhaps castle here, or maybe another possibility is pawn to queen's knight 3. Now he actually played knight takes knight, the direct exchange, and now white could go knight takes knight himself. Looks a bit slow. Or he may go bishop takes knight. He in fact played bishop takes knight, and black will probably exchange here. Yeah, black played bishop takes bishop check, and white should go queen takes bishop, which he has done. Now white apparently has a nice central position now. Black's brought his pieces out. He has indeed exchanged quite a lot, though the position seems to be quite good for white. A lot of pawns in the centre, and he's going to develop his pieces easily. The bishop's going to come to queen 3, and chances of advancing his pawns either by pawn to king 4, pawn to queen's knight 4, maybe even a kingside attack. Black, on the other hand, has still got his queenside pieces a bit blocked in. So here black actually played pawn to queen 4, and let's switch off and think about this position a little. Well, as we can see, black has decided to put a foot in the center, or pawn, and this pawn stops white's further expansion by pawn to king 4 at the moment. Also, by putting the pawn on queen 4, where it eyes white's queen's bishop pawn on qb4, there's now the possibility of an opening of files, and that will give the rooks a bit of work to do. White may eventually play pawn takes pawn, and this will open the queen's bishop file. At least his rook will be able to have a line down the queen bishop file, and it will be eyeing the possible invasion down that file. Meanwhile, black would have the king file, and he may be able to exercise some influence with his rook down that file. Now, I wouldn't actually myself exchange off pawns at the moment, because that would, if I had played pawn takes pawn, black would recapture with the pawn, and then his bishop on qb1 would have opened its diagonal. So I'd probably leave the pawns like that for the time being, and just bring out my pieces, either play rook to bishop 1 or bishop to queen 3 straight away. So white actually played rook to qb1 here, putting his rook on what will potentially be an open line, and black played pawn to qb3. Now you can see the importance of pawns in chess just from this move. White's rook would like to come down the qb file, but even if white exchanged off pawns and black recaptured, say with the king's pawn, the white rook would be biting on a pawn which is defended by another pawn. So in order to break through on the qb file, in the long term, white would have to think of, say, bringing his queen's knight pawn up the board, even up to queen's knight 5, perhaps exchanging it off for black's queen's bishop's pawn, and then black would have to recapture with his queen's knight pawn, and then the rook would in fact be attacking a pawn, rather than would be attacking a pawn which is not defended by another pawn. To make myself clear, say white later played pawn takes pawn, black played king's pawn takes pawn. Here rook takes pawn is no use because of pawn takes rook, and that would be a loss of 5 against 1. So white's eventual plan would be to play pawn to queen's knight 4, pawn to queen's knight 5, pawn takes pawn, and then black plays pawn takes pawn. Now imagine black's knight is not there, then white would play just simply rook takes pawn and win the pawn. So that's your lesson in positional play. Away we go to see how the game actually continued. I think again here I wouldn't yet exchange, rather keep black's bishop boxed in by its own pawns, and I'd probably develop my bishop up to queen 3. Yes, white actually plays bishop to queen 3. Black will probably develop himself maybe queen's knight to queen 2 here, which black in fact did. Now, how is white going to continue? Probably by castling kingside. Yep. This castling maneuver now brings the rook nearer to the center, and this rook can take up, say, active work maybe on king 1, and then white may later break open with pawn to king 4, trying to open another file for the rook. Meanwhile, white's king is out of the way, and black doesn't appear to have any attacks going. Black 2 castled here, and now let's switch off again, see what move we'd actually play. Now this is the part again of the game where it gets difficult to know what to do. We've done all what they recommend. We mobilized our pieces, and they look very pretty, but on the other hand black has got a very solid looking position, all those pawns intact. I might here play pawn to king 4 to expand a bit more in the center, and if he plays pawn takes king's pawn, then bishop takes pawn. Then if he moves his knight to kb3, I just drop my bishop back to queen's knight 1. Instead of pawn to king 4, I might also exchange off with the pawns now. Say play pawn takes pawn, and if black, let's make those moves. If I play pawn takes pawn, if black recaptures with the bishop's pawn takes pawn, then we might be able to go, say, rook to bishop 3, and then the other rook to bishop 1, and try to invade down the queen's bishop file, particularly trying to get a rook onto bishop 7, and see what mischief we can create there. Now let's replace those pieces. White's rook on kb1 and qb1, white's pawn on qb4, and black's got a pawn on qb3, and another one on queen 4. If we take off with our qb pawn and black recaptures with the king pawn, it's true that now when black moves his knight, later on we'll be able to move his knight to kb3 and get his bishop out. But on the other hand, we now will be able to play also pawn to queen's knight 4, and then pawn to knight 5, as I mentioned earlier, and thus weaken black down the queen's bishop file, trying to invade with our rooks down that file. So let's put those bits back again. Black should have pawns on king 3, queen 4, and white should have pawns on queen's knight 2 and qb4. Let's see what white actually played. He played pawn to king 4, and the man says this is a great move. So he played pawn to king 4, opening up the center. Now what are we going to do as black? Well, as black, I'd probably take off one of those pawns, maybe the bishop pawn. I'd have to behave a bit like a hedgehog, certainly for a long time. White isn't actually threatening really to win any pawns yet, but he may, say, push his pawn onto king 5, and then play, say, king 1, and he'd have very good possibilities of attacking black's king, because if the pawn on king 5 would restrain black's pieces and prevent black from organizing a defense to his king. We'll see what black in fact did. Black tried here pawn takes king's pawn, so white goes bishop takes pawn. So now white hasn't got an open QB file for himself, but he will have a king file. His rooks are going to have work down the files, and also they might be able to swing into action sideways, say moving rook to bishop 3 and then moving the rook over sideways to attack the black king. Now after white's bishop takes pawn, black plays knight to bishop 3, hits the bishop, which ought to move back. Knight 1 looks the best. It's not in the way then. Drops back to knight 1, and black played pawn to queen's knight 3 here, presumably in order to get his bishop out. It's not going to be able to get it out in many ways. Now let's pause again and see what sort of move we're going to come up with for white. Now the things for white to watch in this position are he has got chances of attack on the king's side with his bishop and knight and queen, and if possible the rooks. But at the moment black is fairly well defended over there. He's got a knight on kb3 which guards his king's rook pawn. All his pawns are intact around the king, and he's got therefore fairly good chances. White may have to watch also black's pressure down the queen file against his queen pawn, which has to be defended by pieces. he also has to watch in particular black's possible freeing maneuver, pawn to qb4, to tackle the white pawn on queen 4. Say if black gets bishop onto knight 2, then pawn to qb4 will also open up the line of the bishop on knight 2. So in this position I might bring my rook to queen 1, reinforcing the center, and then maybe follow up by queen to bishop 4, perhaps knight to king 5, then bring a rook to bishop 3, and maybe the queen to king's rook 4 and a rook over to knight 3, just sliding the pieces over the king side. But obviously move by move we're going to have to change our plans according to what black does. So white actually played queen to bishop 4 here first. He didn't wait to play king's rook to queen 1, and black played bishop to knight 2. Now what? Let's pause again, think a bit. I think here I'd still play king's rook to queen 1 to dissuade black from playing the freeing maneuver like pawn to queen's bishop 4, which in this case would there be answered by pawn takes pawn and the rook attacks the black queen. So white didn't bother with that. He just shoved his knight in onto king 5. Very strong post for the knight, and maybe he's going to try and bring his rook up to bishop 3 and then over, say, to rook 3 or knight 3 with a strong attack. Let's see what we do for black. Well, I reckon here if black is to get anywhere, he'll have to play pawn to qb4 sometime, maybe now. Then if white plays pawn takes pawn, he can play pawn takes pawn. King's rook to queen 1, queen to bishop 2, yes. And then if white tries rook to bishop 3, then black can play rook to queen 1, trying to get some play down the center files to make up for his rather dangerous position on the king side. So let's have those pieces back. If you followed that, black should have rook on queen's rook 1, queen on queen 1, and the white a rook on qb1, another on kb1, and pawns, black pawn on qb3, qn3, white pawn on queen 4. I think black might also try queen to bishop 2 here, but I think white may just shoot in with rook to bishop 3 to knight 3. Now, it appears black did not do that. He just played queen to bishop 2. He didn't play pawn to qb4, which looked to be the best chance. He played queen to bishop 2, and yeah, that looks a bit slow because of white's possible rook to bishop 3, and black's counterplay in the center may be too late. Let's see how it develops here. Yes, white did play rook to bishop 3 here, and the rook, with the addition of rook onto the attack, white has got a bishop, a knight and a queen. With the addition of the rook, this looks quite dangerous for black because there's a threat of rook to knight 3, queen to king's knight 3, and then simply queen takes knight, and then the pawn can't take the queen because it's pinned against the king, and black, may have to go into certain contortions to find defenses against these threats. So let's see how black defended here. Oh, he actually played knight to rook 4, which to me looks pretty desperate. It looks pretty disastrous, because the knight is just attacking the queen. That's okay, but the queen can easily move away, and black's knight may be just sort of awkwardly placed on the edge of the board. So black played knight to rook 4. Let's see what we do as white here. Well, it took me a little while, but I think I found a way for white to knock off at least a couple of pawns, and between masters, even if you don't actually mate the opposing king, if you can get a pawn or two up without the opponent doing much, then you're going to sort of have what's called a technical victory. It won't be too difficult for you to convert it into a win. I was looking at moves like, say, well, first, we can't play actually rook 3 because knight takes queen, and then if bishop takes pawn check, king to rook 1, and there's no continuation for white, apart from the fact his rook's attacked by the knight. Let's have that white rook back on bishop 3, black knight on rook 4, white queen on bishop 4, black king on knight 1, pawn on rook 2, bishop on knight 1, white bishop on knight 1. Another idea is white to go queen to rook 4 here, but then black can obtain at least temporary respite by playing pawn to king's knight 3, and then if white tries moves like pawn to king's knight 4, black may even go knight to bishop 5, which once again slows things up a bit, or does it? Yes, because white can't go to rook 3 now because knight takes rook check, and there's another threat here of knight to king 7 check, which forks the king and rook. So let's put the black knight back on rook 4 and the white pawn back to king's knight 2. Yeah, we're just looking at white playing queen to rook 4, black defending with pawn to king's knight 3. It may be an idea for white to try pawn to kb4, which threatens now pawn to king's knight 4 because the black knight cannot now go into kb5. But then against white's pawn to kb4, black may try a defensive shot queen to queen 1, which hits the white queen. He's trying to exchange queens to lessen the attack and also hit the queen pawn. So let's put those pieces back. Black queen back to bishop 2, white pawn back to kb2, white queen back to bishop 4, black pawn back to king's knight 2. So black played knight to rook 4. Now there's another possibility for white in playing bishop takes pawn check straight away. Black may go king to rook 1, then white could try, black may king takes bishop, yeah, looks most likely. Then white could play rook to rook 3, yeah, threatening rook takes knight check. If black plays pawn to king's knight 3, you might like to switch off here and decide what move you'd play for white. White's got a cunning move here, knight takes knight's pawn. If the pawn captures the knight, white will play queen takes queen. So black would have to play queen takes queen himself, white would play knight takes queen, and then he's going to pick up the black knight on rook 5 and end up himself a couple of pawns to the good, which, as I said, with between masters should be sufficient in the long run to win. So let's have those pieces back again. Black queen on bishop 2, white queen on bishop 4, black pawns on king's knight 2, king's rook 2, and black king on knight 1. Let's have a white rook on bishop 3, a white knight on king 5, white bishop on knight 1, and there should be a white queen on bishop 4. Anyway, let's see if white actually played this, yeah? Yes, he did. Oh well, looks like I don't miss everything. Bishop takes pawn check was played by white in this position. They mention here, if black played king to rook 1, what would you do here? White would then play knight to knight 6 check, and then he'd win he'd again play queen takes queen. So black has to play king takes. White plays, I expect, rook 3, yeah? And black, after rook 3, black played king back to knight 1. He clearly didn't play pawn to knight 3 because of the variation I suggested. So white played rook takes knight here. Let's switch off and see what white's threatening now in this position. Well, in this position, white may be threatening a simple queen to rook 4, and then rook to rook 8 mate. Or he may even want to win black's queen by rook to rook 8 check, and then king takes rook, knight to knight 6 check, pawn takes knight, queen takes queen. And he'd have won a queen against a rook and knight. So black actually played here pawn to bishop 3. So let's see what we're going to do for white against that move. I like to switch off here. Well, if you chose the queen to rook 4 here, that doesn't look quite so good, because black could play pawn takes knight, and then if rook to rook 8 check, the black king could escape to bishop 2. But a move like rook to rook 8 check looks quite good. Then if king takes rook, knight to knight 6 check, king to knight 1, sorry, king to rook 2, well, knight 1, then queen takes queen, and queen also attacks the bishop on knight 7, so black's going to end up, say, queen for rook down at least, and that should be an easy technical win. Oops. Yes, actually, white actually did play rook to rook 8 check. Black played resigns in that position, because if he plays king takes rook, knight to knight 6 check, it's going to pick up the black queen. So that was a very interesting example of quite a straightforward attack for white, but however straightforward, a lot of difficult points in it. The most difficult point in the game, I think, was to notice that when after white played bishop takes pawn check, king takes bishop, and white played rook to rook 3, black could not play pawn to king's knight 3 because of white playing knight takes knight's pawn, which would end up with getting him into an endgame with a couple of pawns up. Well, let's have a look at another brilliant brevity, and as before, I'll try and pick a game which I haven't seen before, and give you my ideas before I actually look up the move. So, let's go. This game, white played pawn to king 4, and black went knight qb3, which is an Ipswich defense. Now white then played pawn to queen 4, and black replied pawn to queen 4. If you've heard Tim Harding's tape on the Nimzo's other, then you can either play pawn takes pawn, or pawn to king 5, or knight to qb3, and knight to qb3 actually looks to be the most dangerous move for black. White actually played pawn takes pawn, and black played I expect queen takes pawn. Can't do much else, yeah. Then white must defend his pawn. Knight to kb3 looks okay, which is what he did. Here I think Tim recommends pawn to king 4. In fact, black went bishop to knight 5. Now perhaps white could go knight to qb3 here, and then if bishop takes knight, knight takes queen. Perhaps a slightly unclear position, but might end up in white's favour. Let's pause a moment, study the position for a while. Yes, knight to qb3 looks best. Bishop to king 2 also possible though. In fact, white played knight to bishop 3, which this annotator doesn't like much. Oh, well, we'll see why. Then black played bishop takes knight. White played knight takes queen, yeah? So, knight to qb3, bishop takes knight, and now knight takes queen. Obviously, if white had taken back with the pawn, then black could have played queen takes queen's pawn. So, now after bishop takes knight, knight takes queen, black's got to take white's queen. This looks to be forced. White plays knight takes bishop pawn check. Black played here king to queen 2. Interesting. And white plays knight takes rook, I imagine. Yep. Yes, knight takes rook, and now bishop takes pawn. So this is obviously a critical position. So let's switch off again and see what we make of it. Well, I seem to remember that in Harding's tape, black was recommended to go king to queen 1 rather than king to queen 2. I think against both, I rather like the move pawn to queen 5. Then if knight to queen 5, say something like bishop to king 3, looks pretty strong. So let's see what white actually played. He played bishop to kb4, which is clearly to get the knight out, but I think that it'll take black a little while to get round to doing it anyway. I remember from Harding's tape there's a trap here, something like knight takes pawn by black. Did black play that? I have to turn over the page, hang on. Yeah, the trap being something rather like knight takes pawn by black, knight to bishop 7 by white, and then pawn to king 4, bishop takes pawn, bishop knight 5 mate. Now black here could also play perhaps pawn to king 4, quickly develop his pieces, if then say bishop takes pawn, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and bishop checks, and bring the knight out to king 2, and then he should perhaps get his exchange back. So I'm not sure which he's going to do. Pawn to king 4, knight takes pawn. I actually played pawn to king 4. So let's switch off a bit and study the position again. Well, perhaps if white plays pawn takes pawn, then bishop knight 5 check, and then knight to king 2 if possible, and the knight on rook 1 is going. So let's see how white will reply to that. White in fact played pawn takes pawn, so I think I'd flick in a check here. Hope it doesn't bounce. Oh, what a joke. And he did. Bishop to knight 5 check. White could go king to king 2. I don't see what joy it'll give him. Or bishop to queen 2. They both look rather grim. So he went king to king 2. Black went king's knight to king 2, and so he's going to get his rook out. So let's see what white will try now. Pawn to king 6 check. Let's switch off and see how would reply to that move anyway. Well, it doesn't look particularly dangerous because black could just take with the pawn takes pawn, which is what he did, and if white goes knight to bishop 7, pawn to king 4 is going to block the line of the bishop. So how did white reply to that? White did play knight to bishop 7. Yes. Yeah, we could go pawn to king 4, so knight to knight 3 is possible, but I think pawn to king 4, I don't see what white's got against that. Oh, we can also start checking him actually, couldn't we? Let's have a look at that position. See what we can do if we start checking him. Oh, look, it's mate in 2. Knight to queen 5 check, king to king 3, and then knight to bishop 4. The one from king 2 is mate. All the squares are covered. Well, let's make those moves on the board. Knight to queen 5 check, king to king 3, knight to bishop 4 mate. Oh, isn't that pretty? Yes. I think that should go down as a painting. Right, so that was a quick brevity. I think, is that how the game went? Yes, it did. So 14 moves and black mated. Now let's have a look at another game. This is a queen's gambit declined. So let's see how it went. Pawn to queen 4, pawn to queen 4, then pawn to qb4, black goes pawn to king 3. White knight to qb3 and black knight to kb3. So the regular here is going to be bishop to knight 5, which was played, and black played bishop to king 2. Yep. Now, I suppose a choice, perhaps pawn to king 3 here. Yep, pawn to king 3 and black castles. Now, another lot of choice here, perhaps rook to bishop 1 or queen to bishop 2 perhaps is quite a good idea. White actually played knight to bishop 3 and black played pawn to queen's knight 3. So let's switch off again. This is a perhaps sort of a Koganov line. Black trying to develop his bishop by a fianchetto instead of playing something like pawn to qb3. Right, again, perhaps I don't want to develop my king's bishop yet, and perhaps until black has done something about the centre, so queen to bishop 2 or rook to bishop 1. Oh, he didn't mind. White did in fact play bishop to queen 3 here, and black played bishop to knight 2. I see. Now again, white's next move was pawn takes pawn. He must be following some plan of his own. And black replied pawn takes pawn. So let's switch off again, have a look at the position for a little while. Well, black's now must be threatening knight to king 5, which would justify his bishop on knight 2, and exchange off a few bits perhaps. So I think I'd definitely play queen to bishop 2, and if he goes pawn to king's rook 3, because I'm threatening bishop takes knight, aren't I? Then, well, I can either go bishop back to rook 4, or if this is going to be a brilliant c, pawn to king's rook 4. Then pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn. Then knight to king 5 by black. Knight takes knight, pawn takes bishop, takes pawn. Hits that bishop. Bishop exchanges perhaps. Then queen takes. Then if pawn to king's knight 3, queen to king's rook 4. Well, even better, queen takes rook, I expect. That's the master plan. We'll see what happens actually. Oh, I didn't choose any of that. So obviously it must be completely unsound. He played bishop takes knight. simply and clearly. Well, that's one way of going about it. So bishop takes knight, black plays bishop takes bishop, and now let's switch off again. Well, a pawn storming attack by pawn to king's rook 4 might be an idea. That even has the incidental threat of bishop takes pawn check, king takes knight to knight 5 check, bishop takes knight, pawn takes check, king back, queen to rook 5, which is pretty dangerous. And black's bishop on knight 2, as we can take a positional moral from this, isn't having too much effect on the position at the moment. It's a bit blocked in. Now, we wouldn't be able to take liberties with black's position like this, or with white's position, should we say, if black's pawn were not on queen 4 and black had a nice diagonal for his bishop. So, in fact, white came out with pawn to king's rook 4. Yep. And it looks like there's a threat of bishop takes pawn check looming up. So I suppose black will have to play pawn to king's rook 3 here. Well, the annotator here makes the interesting comment that white's pawn to king's rook 4 has the threat, which may not be an actual threat, of bishop takes pawn check. He suggests that it may not be sound. So let's say make a move for black. Say he plays pawn to qb4. White goes bishop takes pawn check. Black goes king takes bishop. White goes knight to knight 5 check. Now, if black goes king back to knight 1, white can play probably queen to rook 5. And that threatens queen to rook 7 mate. Yeah. So that's and if black plays bishop takes knight, then pawn takes bishop, and again there's the mate along the line because the white rooks come into play. Now, if black, instead of going king back to knight 1 on when white checked on knight 5, say he went to knight 3, then white just go queen to queen 3 check. Black king goes to rook 3, white queen to rook 7 mate. What's the other possibilities? The other one is after white's knight to knight 5 check. We've got white queen on queen 1. Black goes king to rook 3. Now, this isn't so clear again. Maybe white can try queen to queen 3 here. Then if black plays rook to rook 1, white will play knight takes pawn check, picking up the queen. So black may go pawn to king's knight 3, and let's try pawn to rook 5 for white. Here pawn takes pawn is too dangerous because of the check on rook 7, and king takes knight looks very dodgy too. Pawn to bishop 4 check. Now if bishop takes knight, perhaps pawn takes pawn check, discovered from the rook. Black could even go bishop to rook 5 here. If he went back to knight 2, then perhaps rook to rook 7 check. That looks rather dodgy for black. Not sure how much. Rook to rook 7 check, king to bishop 3. Yeah. Black's king's a bit in the open, but he is on the other hand 2 pieces up for the time being. Don't know how long he's going to keep them, because white can pick up a few here and there just by exchanging off bits. Well, white has a good attack, shall we say, but a bit unclear. So it may look as though bishop rook 5, which would give a piece back, might have been a better alternative. So we're not sure then how strong white's attack would have been after bishop takes pawn check. Now black in the actual game, so let's put the pieces back. Black should have a knight, king on knight 1, pawn on king's rook 2, pawn on king's knight 2, bishop on kb3, rook on kb1, pawn on bishop 2, and another pawn on qb2, and the rest of the pieces haven't moved yet. White has got a pawn on king's rook 4, bishop on queen 3, knight on kb3, rook on rook 1, queen on queen 1, other knight on qb3, and the other pieces I don't think I moved in the analysis. So black actually played pawn to knight 3. So let's study the position again for a little while, shall we? See how we're going to break down black's position. Well, I think I'd start off by pawn rook 5 anyway, which white did in fact play, and I suppose black will play something like knight to queen 2. Yeah, the commentator says that black should not play pawn to king's knight 4, which is indeed a horrible move, because of pawn to rook 6 and queen to bishop 2. So even if black has blocked that rook file, he hasn't blocked the diagonal. In fact, he's opened the diagonal leading to his king, and in fact he'd probably lose the king's rook pawn after pawn to rook 6 and queen to bishop 2. So black chose here rook to king 1. He didn't play knight to queen 2. Rook to king 1. Well, it's a move. Let's see what will go for white now. Not too easy, this position. I'm not quite sure what to do. Yeah, queen to bishop 2 doesn't look bad here, which black could not really parry with queen to king 2 because of white playing pawn takes pawn, black recapturing, then white playing bishop takes pawn, and then black recapturing, and white playing queen takes pawn check, and black's queen to king 2 would be answered by queen takes rook check. If you follow that in your brains, that's why I didn't like black's last move rook to king 1 too much. I preferred him to develop a knight to queen 2, and then he'd got another piece out at least. So let's see what white's going to do. Now he actually didn't do this, of course, because he doesn't listen to what I'm telling him. He played pawn takes pawn, black played rook's pawn takes pawn. So perhaps they'll give me another chance to get back in the game and find a decent move here. Right, I think I'll still go queen to bishop 2, which actually he did do, so good. And black didn't play queen to king 2 because of my last suggestion. He played bishop back to knight 2. So let's see how much that changes, whether we can still sacrifice on knight 6 or not. Actually, I don't like black's bishop to knight 2 last move too much. I think he might have held out a bit longer by rook to king 2. Then if white sacrifices, he could play rook to knight 2. Then if say queen to rook 6 even, well, no, perhaps, yeah, then maybe then perhaps king to bishop 1. At any rate, he didn't play rook to king 2, he did play bishop to knight 2, and I imagine white can take off because he's got lots of threats coming up. What's going to happen? Yep, bishop takes pawn. Well, we are getting good, aren't we? Pawn takes bishop, queen takes pawn. What's going to happen? Black played knight to queen 2. Let's switch off again here. He should have done that, I think, a long time ago, before rook to king 1. Right, here I think knight to knight 5 is best, which white did in fact play, and he threatening queen to bishop 7, checkmate, so black played queen to bishop 3. Now, you might like to switch off here and see what white would play, because I don't need to, because I've already seen it. Okay. So white played a rook to rook 8 check, and the bishop is pinned, so black must play king takes rook. Then white came in with queen to rook 7 mate. Right, so that was a game, I suppose, a standard sort of attack for white, but of course the build-up to it had many interesting points, and again there was that threat of bishop takes pawn check, and we're not quite sure whether it was a sound attack or not. Well, according to my watch, we've got about 8 minutes left, so I'll see if I can get through another game before the end of this side. If you'll have the position set up, I've got the position set up as well. So let's have a look at this game. White goes pawn to king 4, and black plays pawn to king 3. It's going to be a French defense. Very solid opening. White pawn to queen 4, black also pawn to queen 4. So white has various moves at his disposal here. He's got a king pawn attacked, so he can exchange it, push it on, or defend it. The most regular here is to defend it, and often with a knight. And here white has gone knight to qb3. Black plays here pawn takes pawn to clarify matters in the center. White plays knight takes pawn. Now this defense has a rather passive reputation, but I don't see that it's bad at all, because now black can come out with a knight to f6 if he likes, and challenge white's knight at king 4. White has a pawn on queen 4, and that does have a cramping effect on black's game. Thus often black tries to eliminate that pawn by pawn to qb4, but he's probably able to get a decent game without playing an immediate pawn to qb4. Now after white's knight to takes pawn, black actually played knight to queen 2, and white went knight to kb3, and now black played king's knight to bishop 3. Not clear what white should do here. I'll switch off and have a look at the position. Well, simplest here seems to be knight takes knight check, and then perhaps either develop bishop at queen 3 or to play bishop to king's knight 5, and then decide whether to play queen to queen 2 or bishop to queen 3 and castle kingside. White actually didn't do that. He went bishop to queen 3, allowing black, if he wished, to play knight takes knight and then knight to bishop 3. In fact, black was not in a hurry and played bishop to king 2. White castled, and here black played pawn to queen's knight 3. So this seems to be an interesting point to switch off again. It's possible we could try to rough black up a bit at this juncture, either trying knight takes knight check, and then if knight takes knight, perhaps knight to king 5, and then perhaps bishop knight 5 check. Or we could play knight to king 5 straight away, and if black played knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, would have a strong pawn on king 5. And if he didn't, say if he castled, then of course we get in on bishop 6. And if he played bishop to knight 2, again we might try knight takes knight check and try to get something down with bishop to knight 5. So white actually did play knight to king 5, and let's switch off again and see if we can find any resources for black in this position. Well, the threat of knight to bishop 6 would presumably gain white at least the two bishops. So black either plays bishop knight 2, or he plays knight takes knight. Then after pawn takes knight, knight to queen 4, queen to knight 4. Black doesn't look too good. So what did happen? Black did actually play bishop to knight 2, and white played here knight takes knight check. Now let's see how would we take back. Well, if black takes back with the knight, bishop to knight 5 check seems to dislodge the black king. If he takes back with the bishop, again bishop to knight 5, looks rather strong. In fact, black recaptured with the pawn, so let's now switch off again and have a look at the position. Well, here we can't play bishop knight 5 because our knight is attacked on king 5. We might consider sacrificing on knight by knight takes bishop's pawn. Always attractive when the queen's got a diagonal to rook 5 and the black king is exposed. Say knight takes bishop, king takes queen to rook 5 check, king back to knight 1, and then maybe bishop to rook 6, threatens queen to knight 4 mate. Well, something like that. And if black plays pawn to kb4, perhaps even queen takes bishop's pawn, pawn takes queen, bishop 4, could be a mater. So let's see what happened. White did play knight takes pawn. Black's forked, so he's obviously going to play king takes knight. It looks like white's best is going to be queen to rook 5 check. After white's queen to rook 5 check, which did indeed occur, black played king to knight 1. Now you might like to switch off again, so that how you will continue the attack. I was looking at bishop to rook 6 here, but in fact white played rook to king 1 on the weakened king pawn, and black played knight to bishop 1. So it's white's move again. Let's see what we'd do. Well, bishop to rook 6 looks a crude way to play. Well, he's threatening after that queen checks to knight 7. Then queen to knight 7 check. If black plays queen to queen 4, that doesn't do too much. No, I don't know if he has any other defense against bishop to rook 6. Perhaps pawn to kb4. Well, seems that white actually didn't play bishop to rook 6, though the annotator does say that this would have won. I think perhaps bishop to rook 6, if black plays pawn to kb4, then rook to king 3. Then if bishop to queen 3, white may be set up again for the sack queen takes bishop pawn, and bishop 4 check. But in fact, white chose a different move. He played rook takes pawn, and black took the rook off. Knight takes rook. Yeah. Now bishop to qb4 by white, and black defended with queen to queen 3. Right. So now white's got to justify his mammoth sacrifices. Well, I don't think anything better than bishop to rook 6, and then even follow up by rook to king 1 to king 3. So in fact, white did play bishop to rook 6, which, as the annotator points out, also has the threat of queen checks, and then to knight 7 picking up a rook. Yeah. So black actually played bishop to kb1. So let's switch off again and see what happens. Yeah, last move by black was bishop to kb1. Right, the white ought to play rook to king 1 here, which he did play. Clearly, if black plays bishop takes bishop, rook takes knight, queen takes bishop takes rook check. Sorry, bishop takes queen check, and then queen to bishop 7 is going to be mate. So black will have to find some defense to his knight. I'm not sure he's got any. Black played bishop to QB1 here, and you might like to switch off and decide again what you'd play as white. White's actual move was queen to king 8, and black chose bishop to queen 2, and you may wish to switch off again. Finish was rook takes knight, and then if rook takes queen, rook takes rook discovered, check, bishop take, bishop to king 3, bishop takes bishop check, queen takes bishop, rook takes bishop was made. Brilliant Brevities, Part 2, Side 2. Now, let's set up the pieces again, and we're going to get through as many games as we can in the famous play-along style of audio chess. Right, so let's go. White pawn to king 4, black pawn to QB3. White played here pawn to QB4, a change from the ordinary pawn to queen 4, which they generally play. So I expect black here nonetheless played pawn to queen 4. He isn't constrained to do that. He can also play pawn to queen 3 and go into types of King's Indian positions. But pawn to queen 4 is what one expects from a Caro-Kann. White plays pawn takes pawn, black. Actually, white played bishop's pawn takes pawn here, and black played pawn takes pawn. One would expect here white to go pawn takes pawn again here, but in fact he chose rather unusual continuation, bishop to knight 5 check, and looks like black could either play bishop to queen 2 here or knight to QB3. Both look reasonable. And in fact black plays bishop to queen 2, and white played queen to rook 4. White looks to be a bit of a rabbit actually. He's only going to exchange off the pieces, and thus make his advantage or his opening initiative smaller. So let's switch off, have a look at this position now from black's point of view, see what we can do. Well, I think I'll just take off the pawn here and leave it up to white to waste time getting it back. Black did play pawn takes pawn, and white bishop takes bishop check. Now here again, queen takes bishop certainly looks okay. If black then plays queen takes pawn, black can go, white goes queen takes pawn, black can go knight to KB3, and he's gaining time on the queen. Now, in fact black played knight takes bishop, cunning rejoinder. If white goes queen takes pawn, then black can go perhaps knight to bishop 4, then even come in onto queen 6 check. So yes, this is a bit tricky for white. Can he, if he plays knight to QB3, black can go knight to KB3 himself, and same thing. So it doesn't look too easy to see what white's going to do now. Well, he did play queen takes king's pawn, and now black goes knight to bishop 4 most certainly, yeah. and there's that threat of knight to queen 6 check. So white played queen to qb4. Let's switch off again, study the position a little, see how we're going to deliver a few knockouts. Well, I must admit I'm a bit stuck here. Knight to queen 6 check, maybe black will go, say, king to king 2. Then if rook to bishop 1, well then queen to knight 5 check. Queen to queen 2, then queen takes queen check, king takes queen, knight to qb3 for white. And though the endgame isn't marvellous for white, it looks tenable, so I can't actually see a crusher. So let's see how the game develops now. He actually goes knight to queen 6 check, white goes king to king 2, and black did go rook to bishop 1 here. So how's white going to play? Oh, well, white actually just played queen takes knight, which is clearly a blunder, because well, it's clearly a blunder, but the annotator doesn't mention queen to knight 5 check here. Let's see, there's no pawns on queen's rook 3 that can take the queen. Queen to knight 5 check, say if black goes rook to bishop 3, well, white can go knight to qb3. Seems to be okay for him. Just shows that black should have played queen takes, what's his name, bishop on move, whatever it was, when you played bishop takes bishop check. So white played queen takes knight instead of queen to knight 5 check. Black played queen takes queen check, white played king takes queen, and black played rook takes bishop, which is the point of his combination. Now we've got a very beautiful position. None of the white army can move except for his king. White played king to king 2. You may like to switch off and consider how you continue here. Well, black played pawn to king's knight 3 here, and white actually resigned. Seems a bit premature in view of his earlier play. Resign on move 12. What do? They give pawn to queen 4 as a variation, bishop to knight 2, king to queen 2, bishop rook 3 check, yeah, clear, king to king 2, knight to bishop 3, pawn to king's knight 3, time of pawn to king's knight, kb4, castles by black. Perhaps I should have pawn to kb4 here, but then king's rook to bishop 1. Yes, that looks rather strong. With the second rook coming in, it really is 0 for black. Yeah, well, he resigned in good time anyway. Now for another one. If you've got the pieces ready, set up in the original position, let's go ahead. Pawn to king 4 by white, pawn to qb3 by black, another Caro-Kann defense. White here plays knight to qb3, again instead of the more normal pawn to queen 4. Black pawn to queen 4, and white knight to bishop 3, which is the 2 knights variation against the Caro-Kann. Now here black played pawn takes pawn, bishop to knight 5 is another possibility. Knight takes pawn by white, and now black played bishop to bishop 4. So let's switch off again, study the position a little. Well, knight's attacked. Looks like we should move it, say to knight 3. Knight dropped back to knight 3, and black dropped his bishop back to knight 3 as well. Let's study the position again. It's slightly different from the other sort of position with white having a pawn on queen 4 instead of a knight on kb3. Now the annotator keeps giving me hints here by saying that all black's moves were blunders. Say he'd move the bishop out to bishop 4 and then back to knight 3. So that leads me to imagine that maybe pawn to king's rook 4 by white here, and then if pawn to king's rook 3, perhaps pawn to kb3 is better. Knight to king 5, perhaps by white, bishop rook 2, maybe say queen to rook 5. Yeah, pawn to king's knight 3, bishop to qb4. Then if pawn takes queen, bishop takes pawn is mate. So pawn to king 3 perhaps, then queen back to king 2. And black has got a very unpleasant position, apart from the fact white is threatening knight takes king's bishop pawn. Let's go back anyway and see what actually occurred. We'll have a white queen on queen 1, bishop on kb1, white's knight on kb3, black's pawns on king 2, king's knight 2, king's rook 2, and a bishop on knight 3, and white's got his pawn on king's rook 2. Yes, out comes white with pawn to king's rook 4, and black pawn to king's rook 3. Now if white goes pawn to rook 5, it looks like it will transpose, so it looks like knight to king 5 is the move. This is the novelty. White should gain at least the 2 bishops, because he had a knight. He moved his knight to kb3 on move 3 instead of moving his pawn to queen 4, so now he can go knight to king 5. So let's see how black will answer this threater. Just drops the bishop back to rook 2. Maybe here bishop to bishop 4 simply, and then if pawn to king's 3, then queen to rook 5, but then perhaps, and then if queen to bishop 3 for black, perhaps knight to king 4. Then, and then if, well then queen to bishop 4 for black is perhaps just about tenable. So maybe queen to rook 5 first then. Yeah, queen rook 5 comes first for white, and now it's black's turn to think. Let's see what we'll do here. Well, there's a threat of queen takes pawn, mate. If black goes queen to queen 4, bishop to qb4 is quite good enough. So it looks like pawn to king's knight 3 is the only sensible move, which is what black played. So where should we put the queen? Well, we could try the suggestion of bishop to qb4, and then if pawn to king 3, queen to king 2. But if we're feeling sharp, perhaps straight away queen to bishop 3. But then queen to queen 4 for black may rather upset us, because it does hit the knight and the queen. Right, so let's think again. Okay, I'll stick to bishop 4 and then queen to king 2. Which white did in fact play bishop to bishop 4 to threaten the mate, and if black can of course go queen takes, queen's pawn check, but I think would end in him losing a couple of pawns as well as ruining his position. So black played pawn to king 3. Might try queen to bishop 3 here again, but then black may play queen to bishop 3. So it looks like queen to king 2. Yep, queen to king 2 is played by white. And now black is threatened by this knight takes KB pawn. He played knight to bishop 3. Black played knight to bishop 3, which in fact misses the point of white's last move. He should have obviously done something about defending that king pawn. Not sure how. Maybe just queen to bishop 2 is the right move, and white would just continue to build up his position by moves like pawn to queen 4, I expect. Black's bishop on rook 2 doesn't look to be a very active piece. So black played knight to bishop 3. White, I hope you all saw, including me, knight takes king's pawn, KB pawn, king takes knight, queen takes pawn check, king to knight 2, and then queen to bishop 7 was mate. So that's a nice pretty finale, and white, you may be interested, knows the Alekhine, and I think it's a typical Alekhine game in the sense that he's very sharp to spot the slight weakness of black's opening play and really pounce upon it. There was a slight difference between him playing knight to bishop 3 and pawn to queen 4. Black missed it, but white was awake and did not miss it. Now, if you'll return your pieces again to the original position, here we go again. Another of these quick crushes. This one, white plays pawn to king 4, popular move in short games. Knight to KB3, the provocative Alekhine's defense. White pawn to king 5, and black knight to queen 4. So black has a temporary outpost in the center for his knight, but that knight can nonetheless be driven away. White drives the knight away with pawn to QB4, black knight to knight 3. And now white actually played pawn to bishop 5, hitting the knight but giving it its outpost back. So this is a bit of a double-edged move. Black moves his knight back to queen 4. White's got a choice here. I expect knight to QB3 would try and dislodge black again from the outpost. Maybe bishop to QB4. White actually played knight to QB3, and black played knight takes knight. White recaptures with the queen's pawn. So the position doesn't look too bad for white now. Black hasn't been able to utilize that weak square and the queen 4 square, and now white has been able to open the queen file, and he's got a lot of pressure down that file. Perhaps black was unwise to exchange off the knights, I'm not sure. Now, black here played pawn to queen 3. Now let's stop and think for a bit. This position doesn't look too clear actually. If we exchange off all the pawns, that will perhaps help black's development. I'd be tempted to play bishop to bishop 4, hoping black will play pawn takes pawn, then I can win his queen by bishop takes pawn check. Black will probably then go, instead of pawn takes pawn, pawn to king 3, and that would at least give us a chance of leaving his bishop blocked in. Perhaps we could then play bishop's pawn takes pawn, black bishop's pawn takes pawn, and then knight to kb3 for white, followed by castles and queen to king 2. Should give us a bit of pressure in the center, slight edge. White chose a different method. He actually played queen to knight 3 here. Well, as black, I think I'd take off everything that was offered, including the pawns. But I can see white may get a bit of pressure down the queen file. This is a bit unusual, this move. So let's stop and look at it for a bit. Well, there's some interesting lines here, like pawn takes king's pawn by black, bishop to king 3 for white, pawn to king 3 black, rook to queen 1, queen to bishop 3 for black, pawn to king's rook 4 for white, threatening bishop to knight 5, and mate on queen 8. Then if black goes pawn to king's rook 3, bishop to knight 5, pawn takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, which hits the queen and the rook. Black plays rook takes rook, white plays pawn takes queen, black plays rook takes knight. And then we'd have to see who was winning. Still, even despite such a frightening variation, I think I still play pawn takes king pawn by black. That's what he did. Mr. Reinfeld, bloke who was annotating this game, didn't think much of that. He suggests knight to bishop 3 for black. Oh well, see how it goes. White actually played bishop to king's knight 5 here now. Obviously bishop to king 3, didn't want to let us play pawn to king 3. Still, I suppose we're going to have to go queen to queen 2 here. And then if rook to queen 1, perhaps queen to bishop 4. Yes, it doesn't look too easy, does it? Let's stop again then. Yes, so bishop to king's knight 5 does look rather strong, and it'd be interesting to see how this game develops. White's fantastic mobility against black's solid position. Now, oh, what did black choose here? He played bishop to king 3. Doesn't look very good. What would have bishop to king 3 was played, so surely white can then go queen takes knight's pawn, and then if bishop to queen 4, perhaps bishop to knight 5 check. White played after bishop to king 3, queen takes knight's pawn, black played knight to queen 2. Looks like rook to queen 1. Doesn't look bad here. In fact, white played castles queenside. Black queen to bishop 1. Now let's switch off again, study the position. Well, queen to bishop 6 looks a good shot here. Certainly pins black down, threatens knight to bishop 3, and knight takes king's pawn, intensifying everything. White played queen to bishop 6, black pawn to queen's rook 3. White knight to bishop 3, and black can't go pawn to kb3 because of queen takes bishop. Well, you can go pawn to kb3. It doesn't look very nice after queen takes bishop, shall we say. Yeah, it looks horrible. Oh, what can black do? Played rook to rook 2. Looks pretty desperate. Let's see. Knight takes king's pawn. Perhaps black may try and queen to knight 2 against that. So let's stop the tape and have a look. Well, looks like knight takes king's pawn pretty good even against queen to rook 1. So is white played knight takes king's pawn. Black didn't go queen to rook 1. Perhaps against queen to rook 1, white has anyway rook takes knight, and then if queen takes queen, then knight takes, and then if bishop takes, then knight takes the rook on rook 2, which would wind up with him having, should be an extra piece. So after knight takes pawn, black did play pawn to bishop 3. Well, queen takes something, looks pretty horrible. This was not played. White actually played bishop to qb4, and here black decided to give up the ghost, because if bishop takes bishop, then rook takes knight, and then if pawn takes knight, rook takes king pawn, double checkmate. Very nice. Yeah. Well, nice finish, though I was a bit suspicious of white's of black's move bishop to king 3. Surely black had better than that. Let's drop a few of the pieces back and see what would have happened then. White's got his queen on knight 3, king on king 1, rook on rook 1, and a knight on knight 1, and a pawn on king 5, and black's got a bishop on bishop 1, a queen on queen 1, pawns on kb2, king 2, qb2, queen's knight 2, and queen's rook 2. So white had just played bishop. Oh, sorry, black's got a pawn on king 4, hasn't he? Black's just played pawn takes the king's pawn. So white played bishop to knight 5. Perhaps if black goes queen to queen 2 here, then if rook to queen 1, perhaps queen to bishop 4. Then if bishop to qb4, black cannot play queen takes bishop because the bishop takes pawn mate, but he cannot play pawn to king 3 because of rook to queen 8 mate. But black could go, say, knight to bishop 3 here. Might be able to survive in this position. Right, so we'll leave that unfinished symphony, go on to another one. Right, if we'll have the position set up, let's go through another game. This one began with white going pawn to queen 4 and black pawn to queen 4, so it's going to be a queen's gambit, I expect. Pawn to qb4 by white, black pawn to king 3, white knight to qb3, black knight to kb3. White here didn't pin, he played knight to kb3 himself now, and black bishop to king 2, just developing another piece. White now did bishop to knight 5, and black queen's knight to queen 2. So pawn to king 3, all this nice and smooth, getting the other bishop out. Black castles, king side. White rook to bishop 1, putting his rook on the file which will potentially be open because of the pawns which are eyeing each other on qb4 and queen 4. Now black played pawn to queen's knight 3. So this is a rather similar game to one of the others we had a look at earlier. Let's switch off again, just look at the position. Well, black is striving to put his bishop on the long diagonal, and then perhaps play pawn takes pawn, giving it a nice line. So white may quite possibly try and thwart this plan by trying to force black to have a pawn on queen 4, which would therefore block the line of any bishop that got there. White played pawn takes pawn, black again. Black in fact did capture pawn takes pawn. Now white moved queen to rook 4. Looks a bit crude, but certainly logical. May want to stick a bishop on rook 6, or maybe something on knight 5 and into bishop 6. Let's see if there's any reasonable reply for black against that. Well, natural move is pawn to queen to rook 3, but this may run into a bit of trouble after queen to bishop 6. Bishop to knight 2 is another possibility. Against that, perhaps bishop to rook 6 for white, and then perhaps queen to bishop 1 for black. Might be just tenable. Another possibility of black is pawn to bishop 4, may be the best chance. Black actually played bishop to knight 2, and white did go bishop to queen's rook 6. Yeah, it looks best here, queen to bishop 1, but in fact this was not played. Bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop occurred. Now white does have a certain grip on those squares, on the white squares. Let's pause again here. If black goes pawn to qb4 now, white should, I expect, castle simply, then maybe bring his rook to queen 1. There'll be quite a lot of pressure against black's centre. Now, black actually chose pawn to bishop 3. So let's stop again, think about this. Well, I'd like to play queen and knight 7 here, but I don't see a ready answer to queen to bishop 1 by black, so I'd probably just castle here. White did indeed castle, and black now played knight to king 5. May stretch his position a bit, but if he can get away with it, he's okay. I just feel that if we can play knight takes knight here, though, that will obviously open the line of our rook against his bishop's pawn. So let's stop, see if we can take advantage of that. Well, bishop takes bishop here, followed by queen to knight 7. Seems to give black lots of suffering, except, yeah, even black plays queen to queen 3, then knight takes 9, rook takes bishop's pawn. So white did play bishop takes bishop, black queen takes bishop. Now queen to knight 7. Yeah? How is black to defend his bishop's pawn? I don't know. Black played king's rook to bishop 1, so you might like to switch off here, study the position a little. Yes, I hope you all saw it. Knight takes queen's pawn, and then if pawn takes knight, rook takes rook check. So where's black going to go? Plays queen to queen 3, and you may wish to switch off again, study the position again, see if you can find a decent move for white. after black's queen to queen 3. White played rook takes pawn, and what did black do? Oh, black resigned. Yes, quite right too. If he plays queen takes knight, rook takes rook check, picks up the queen for a start, as well as everything else. If he plays rook takes rook, then queen takes, oh, the queen is rook check is one possibility, or even queen takes the other rook, and then if queen takes queen knight, king 7 check and knight. Oh, that leaves white a couple of pawns up. The other way might even have left a rook up. So yeah, white would first play queen takes rook and then take the other rook. So that was another interesting 16-move game. Brings out the beauties of the Queen's Gambit, and also shows how white can win in a way by opening a file and bringing a rook down. Interesting, straightforward attack by white, queen to rook 4 and then bishop to rook 6. Thought black played rather weakly in moving his bishop to knight 2 and then not going queen to bishop 1 to try and get the big queen to knight 2 and cover up his weak black squares. Right, I think that's enough brilliant brevities. I hope you enjoyed them, and I'll take my leave of you here.